Ukraine is under the heaviest Russian air assault since the start of the war, with Russia firing hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. That's forced residents of the capital, Kyiv, and other cities to spend their nights in air raid shelters. But the United States has been keeping Ukraine guessing as Putin bombards the country. After the Pentagon said last week that it would pause some arms shipments, President Trump is now saying the U.S. will be supplying some weapons. What kind of damage has this uncertainty caused? This week on To The Point, we're looking at what it means when Putin attacks and Trump dithers. How long can Ukraine hold on? I'm Claire Richardson in Berlin. We have a truly fantastic panel this week. I'm so pleased to introduce Wolfgang Ischinger, the longtime leader of the Munich Security Conference and former German ambassador to the United States and the UK. Gustav Gressel, a military expert with the National Defense Academy in Vienna. American journalist Melinda Crane, a familiar face on this show. And we have DW's correspondent Nick Connolly, who's been reporting from Ukraine for us throughout the war and also before Russia's full-scale invasion. Welcome to you all. Wolfgang, Donald Trump took office convinced that he could somehow convince Vladimir Putin to find a deal to make peace with Ukraine, even for a while claiming that it was Ukraine's President Zelensky that was the obstacle to peace. But it seems like he's becoming increasingly irritated. This week, he said that Putin's words are ultimately meaningless. Do you think we are now back to square one?
Well, I think in international diplomacy, consistency, clarity is really important. So if what President Trump has now said means that he's going to say that and stick to it and maybe even enhance it by saying, I will make sure, the United States of America will make sure that Russia is not going to win this war. That's what he really should say. Then we're in good shape.
Mm-hmm. So that uncertainty is, of course, has all kinds of effects. I'm curious if we could just get some background from Gustav about why we saw the Trump administration freeze these deliveries of arms in the first place. Was it strategic, based on the United States' own stocks and needs?
No, it wasn't. The current Minister of Defense has actually unilaterally, so-called, halted shipments before. His policy director, Corby, even before the Trump administration became the Trump administration, advocated for halting American shipments to Ukraine. For them, it's a kind of ideological thing. Once they halted them, of course, immediately reports from the Pentagon leaked that actually most of the weapon systems on that list stopped were not critical for U.S. defense. They were predominantly elderly missiles that would have to be disposed. They would have to be scrapped. The U.S. would have to pay money to scrap them safely, but so they are actually delivered to Ukraine because they would fire them in a short cycle. Of course, then basically Trump, who was not informed about the decision, then later basically ruled in to stop that. It is the opposite of anything strategic. It's basically inner administrative struggles for interpretation and policy that basically make it on the world stage.
Melinda, what do you make of these tensions within the U.S. administration that Gustav is alluding to, that Trump perhaps didn't even know that this pause had been ordered by the Pentagon?
So it seems. There was a press conference at which someone asked a question about it, and he said, I don't know who ordered this, you tell me. Why don't you tell me? As if the reporter would know better than he himself. The fact is, this about face that we're seeing on the part of President Trump is because he's angry. He's really frustrated, but personally frustrated. His politics are all about his personal, his show, essentially, and whether it's playing well with the public, both domestically and internationally. So essentially, Putin has thwarted him, and that makes him very, very angry. And he used some pretty strong language this week to describe what Putin is now putting on the table, as he said. But the fact is, he had been looking like his frustration at the fact that he couldn't get to a deal with these two parties and, establish the peace agreement that he was promising to do initially in 24 hours. It looked like he might just walk away from the whole thing. You remember some weeks ago he said, "This isn't even my war, this is Biden's war." Now, suddenly the turnaround is very much about him being angry at Vladimir Putin in this moment where the bombs are falling so visibly that they are essentially an insult to Donald Trump's concept that he could influence. But that doesn't mean that the about-face couldn't change, and that's exactly what Wolfgang was saying at the beginning. Trump is nothing if not inconsistent. The only thing about him that's consistent is his unreliability, unpredictability, and the fact is he could easily switch course again.
Now, those bombs falling probably feel quite far away from the Oval Office, obviously not for those in Ukraine. So let's bring in our correspondent, Nick Connolly, who's had more than a few sleepless nights over the last few days. Nick, how has it been reporting from the capital, Kyiv?
Well, there's certainly lots of bleary faces here in Kyiv this morning. People where you can tell they have not only slept badly last night, but for the last couple of weeks. And, people's ability to work, do their jobs and just go about their daily lives is severely impacted, even if they haven't been directly hit by missiles. And you see people who are basically reappraising whether this is a place they want their children to be. I know people here who brought their children back from Europe, back from the EU, after the first year of war, when it seemed clear that the front lines were going to stay far away from Kyiv, where it seemed like Ukraine was going to get reliable air defense. And lots of those people are now reappraising whether they want their children to be here, or even if they want to stay here, if they can leave or at least go to further away regions from the front line. So that is a real shift. The big question is ballistic missiles. Is Ukraine able to shoot them down? Last week we had an attack where seemingly not a single ballistic missile was shot down. That was just the night before the call with Trump. Now, last night it seemed like most of them were shot down. At least the Ukrainians are saying they shot them all down. There's some debate whether that's the full picture. But certainly those stocks are critically low. And when you hear that now Trump is saying Ukraine can have 10 interceptor missiles for its Patriots rather than the 30 that were allegedly promised in that last shipment that was halted, that is not even enough for one night's protection of the city.
Yeah, very grim news if you're in the capital, Kyiv, indeed. Now, as we've heard, it's just the sheer number of drone and missile attacks on Ukraine that has increased massively. So let's take a moment to take a closer look at the situation on the front lines.
In the Donetsk region, fighting continues on the Eastern Front, not just in Kyiv. German security authorities allege that Russia is even using chemical weapons. An estimated fifth of Ukraine's territory is now occupied by Russia, putting the country under intense pressure. And the U.S. president has changed his mind once again, vowing to continue supporting the country militarily.
We're going to send some more weapons. We have to. They have to be able to defend themselves. They're getting hit very hard now.
Drones play a crucial role in this war. They are cheap, flexible, and difficult to intercept. This Russian military footage shows alleged attacks on Ukrainian targets. But Ukraine creates and uses its own drones and has recently announced a partnership with American and Danish defense companies. More than 100,000 drones are expected to be produced this year. Are drones the game changer in this war? And for which side?
So, Gustav, when Trump says we're going to have to send more weapons, do we know which ones he's referring to?
No, we don't know. He generally, or the press communique by the Defense Ministry said that it's going to be defensive weapons. So and that's a similarly blurred and unhelpful discussions we had in Germany 2 years ago. What's a defensive weapon? You can use most weapons for the offense as well, and even sort of seemingly offensive weapons like main battle tanks are often used in defensive operations. I guess they will refer predominantly to air defense weapons, Patriot interceptors, etc. But the problem is, will there be enough? There's a sort of this originated from a battle within the DoD on how many interceptors can be assigned to which direction, Europe, Pacific, domestic reserve stocks. And that debate will continue, no matter what Trump says now.
Nick, I want to get your perspective here because we know that the pause on arms shipments did affect Patriot missiles, and as we record, I'm not clear whether that pause will hold. Maybe you could just paint a picture for us what it means, what the implications are for Ukraine of perhaps not getting these shipments.
I mean, the Patriot system is the only game in town for intercepting Russian ballistic missiles. It's as simple as that. The European equivalent SAMP-T that was provided in a smaller quantity by France and Italy simply doesn't work. When you speak to the military people here, they say against the Russian ballistic missiles, even though it claims and is sold as a system that's able to do that, it just doesn't work. So this is a system that's produced by the US, and obviously some of these systems have been handed to Ukraine by Germany, originally manufactured in the US, but simply the defense base isn't there to produce enough of these interceptor missiles, enough of the systems. And the reality is, when you speak to kind of aviation experts, if Ukraine doesn't get enough of these backstocks of supplies for its Patriots, basically Russia can then just pick off all the high-value targets here in Ukraine, starting from the power infrastructure, all the kind of aerodromes where the F-16 fighter jets are based. Basically, all of the kind of high-value stuff here will just be totally vulnerable to those Russian attacks. And we're seeing Russia ramping up its production of ballistic missiles. And when you hear that the US is planning to produce 600, 700, 800, maybe there's different estimates of these kind of interceptor missiles of one kind in a year, that is basically just about maybe enough for Ukraine alone, let alone all the other NATO allies and the US itself.
And Wolfgang, there's some ongoing discussion about potentially Germany buying Patriot batteries from the United States and then Germany then sending them on to Ukraine. Do you think that this is a likely plan to happen?
Well, that's not going to solve the whole problem, obviously, but it would be one additional measure. Another measure is, but also that will take some time, is the beginning campaign for European and hopefully also American companies to build production plants in Ukraine so that we don't have, the transport issue. I think that's quite courageous, actually, of some of the European German companies involved to start production in Kyiv, given the risks involved. But I think that could help. And again, it's part of what we need in terms of a consistent pattern that would make it clear to the Kremlin that, contrary to what is currently going on, they cannot really win this war, because we're not going to give up supporting whatever is going to be necessary to Ukraine. But it's a long way, and it's an uphill battle, admittedly.
And Melinda, even if that does signal to the Kremlin that they're serious about the future of Ukraine, do we know how long it would take from the moment of investing to actually seeing a result on the battlefield for Ukraine?
I think at this point, it's really day to day. We heard Nick tell us earlier that Ukraine, they're in there for the years to come. They're going to keep on fighting as long as it takes, that's really a question for Nick. But let me say that there's also a bigger part of this picture than weapons alone. The U.S. also has not so far instituted new economic sanctions on Russia. To the contrary, they essentially did not implement sanctions that were in place over a number of months, giving great encouragement to the Russians that they can, in fact, do all the sanctions runarounds that they use with impunity, with no disturbance. And that has allowed them to rebuild their base, keep their economy flowing. There are a lot of things both the U.S. and the EU could do to make sanctions hurt a lot more than they currently do. The U.S. has also stopped working with other partners on fighting misinformation that comes out of Russia. They've stopped working with other partners on cyber defense against all kinds of hybrid attacks that the Russians are waging. So all of this, when we ask, what is the U.S. stance? How reliable are they? We have to look at that full palette. There is some indication that the U.S. may now go back to thinking more about sanctions under the pressure that's being applied by Senator Lindsey Graham. But we don't know that for sure. And that is very much part of the question. How long can Ukraine hold out is a function of all of these different areas and not only weapons deliveries.
Yeah, absolutely right. Trump has said he's considering additional sanctions to pressure Putin, but it raises a really important point, and perhaps one that Wolfgang could pick up, that when you look at what the Europeans are doing, even today, you see Europe importing almost $24 billion worth of Russian oil and natural gas. Why hasn't it gotten more serious about trying to cripple the Russian economy?
Well, you're asking a good question. I think work has been going on, and the quantity of oil and gas that's being bought in Russia to supply as supplies to Europe has been decreasing. Not enough, in my estimation. We should try to stop this totally. We should stop the shadow fleet that goes back and forth through the Baltic and through other channels. And I would totally agree with Melinda. What really matters in coming weeks and months is the question whether, let me call it the Lindsey Graham package, the sanctions package, which, as I understand, has obtained the support of more than 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. Around 80 senators, apparently, I'm told, are in favor. In other words, it would be an easy victory for the Trump administration if they decide to take this step. That would really hurt Russia, because it would actually impose on countries that do business with Russia a kind of, favorite theme for President Trump, 500% tariff. So here we are in Trump territory, and that would really hurt. Let's see whether he takes this step.
By the way,
that would be really essential.
As you say, perhaps the senators just waiting for the nod from Trump to see this forward.
I think so.
Melinda, did you want to comment there?
I was going to say that one of the key issues here in this sanctions package is that Trump wants to be sure there's a clause in there that makes it clear that foreign policy authority, including over sanctions, rests entirely with the president. Yeah. This is part of the overall strategy of the Trump administration, very much guided by some of those factions that you referred to earlier, to consolidate executive power. And therefore, that clause is currently being adapted in order to make sure that Trump could, even if he imposes sanctions, lift them at any time.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
That's a great point. Now, I do just want to pick up from one other thing we heard about in the report, perhaps with Gustav, about the drones that we're seeing. The piece poses the question, could they be a game changer in this conflict? Do you think that they could be?
Well, there already are. If Ukraine were solely dependent on donations by the Western countries, Ukraine would have already fallen. It hasn't, and that's due to the domestic drone production. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense this year will procure between 5 and 8 million drones this year. That's more than artillery shells. So, and on top of that, we have to add countless drones that are made by volunteers, that are bought by the soldiers themselves, that come on top of this 5 to 8 millions. So that gives a quantitative idea how many of them are used and what kind of drone usage is part of the daily life on the front lines.
Absolutely. Now, I do just want to turn to another issue that always comes up in this conflict, which is that as Ukraine's currently already being left in the lurch, there are intelligence agencies that are warning already about what Russia's next move could be. Does Russia have the appetite and the means to expand its territorial designs? Of course, the Baltic states have long feared that they're in the crosshairs, and Lithuania, which shares borders with Russia and its exclave Kaliningrad, fears that it could be next.
Lithuania's small army wouldn't be able to withstand a potential Russian attack. The country has 2.8 million residents and only 15,000 soldiers. The NATO member state wants to continue expanding its military and will soon start spending 6% of GDP on armaments. But the Baltic state would probably still remain an easy target for Putin. On the east, Lithuania borders Belarus, a close ally to Russia. To the south is the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, locking the country in a tight grip. Germany has decided to support Lithuania. Over the next 2 years, a brigade of around 5,000 German soldiers are expected to be stationed in Lithuania. Their motto? NATO solidarity with an alliance state. By stationing a German brigade in Lithuania, we are making a lasting promise. Your safety is our safety. Article 5 of the NATO agreement states that if one member state is attacked, it is an attack on all member states. But are NATO and the German military confident that they would win a war against Russian troops in Lithuania?
So let's put the big question to Wolfgang. Are you worried that Putin will try to push and see how far he can go with a possible attack on somewhere like Lithuania?
Well, you know, in international diplomacy, you are well advised to base your assumptions on the possible worst case. And the worst case is exactly what Vladimir Putin himself described when he outlined his long-term strategy in 2021. He referred to his goal of turning the clock back to 1997. What happened in 1997? 1997 was the decision in Madrid by NATO to open the door to new members. So what he wants is he wants to go back to a situation where neither Poland nor the Baltic states, nor Romania, nor any of the other new NATO members in Central Europe are going to be part of the West, but are sort of part of the buffer zone which Russia would use to protect itself. It's very old-style thinking, but we have to take that seriously. I did not think that he was going to do what he did in 22, because I thought that's actually not a rational decision to attack Ukraine. And I think we're well advised to learn from that, even if we think it probably doesn't make sense to attack a NATO country. We need to assume that maybe it will happen, and that's why it's a good idea to take all the steps that would provide the strongest possible deterrent effects against Russia.
To prepare for all eventualities. Yeah. Well, Linda, I understand you've just been to Lithuania on a reporting trip, and I guess the question that's hanging in the air, perhaps for people there too, is would NATO actually come to its defense in the event of a Russian attack?
When I posed that question, the answer was pretty uniformly yes. They do believe that NATO's behind them. They didn't join just yesterday. They've been an established member. And they believe that their position is even stronger since Finland and Sweden joined the alliance last year. So I think that part is settled. But what they also are doing is they are preparing for the worst. And they are doing it in a very realistic, very pragmatic way. And they also say, look, the conflict's already here. We are facing constant jamming and spoofing of navigation systems coming from Moscow, constant hybrid warfare in terms of misinformation, cyber warfare, hacking attacks. So they are very well aware of the threat that is there, and they have an integrated concept of civilian and military defense that is very, very impressive, much along the lines of Finland. And I was there as well in Finland, and both countries are receiving multiple delegations now from all over Europe wanting to know, how are you doing this? How do you integrate these components into a resilient system that can ward off an attack that could well be coming?
Yeah, Gustav, many intelligence agencies think that as long as Russia is tied down in Ukraine, it would be difficult for it to open an entirely different front in a place like Lithuania. Do we know how long it would potentially take Russia to build up its forces in order to have the kind of manpower possible to do that?
Well, currently the Russians need 2 years to replace 1 year of losses in Ukraine, in their defense industry. So if Russia would be served a win quickly, they could come very quickly at us. Of course, if they are not served a victory, the Russian army is still struggling in Ukraine, and we don't know how the war will end. There is still a chance that the war will not end in a Russian victory there, which would certainly undercut the Russian ability to rearm. That's why Ukraine is so important. It buys the time. It's not a charity event. It's something that determines European security. Because although we had big ticket budget decisions to increase defense spending, we have to keep in mind that spending is the beginning, but then you start to act until you have militarized all the money, spend it on structures, capabilities, and make them actually work. Because if you set up new brigades, set up new forces, they need some time to train to get into their job. That will all take time. The Russians now already have an army that is large, that is mobilized. They have in Ukraine more than 650,000 soldiers, several thousand main battle tanks, roughly somewhere in the north of 2,500. That's already deployed in the field and ready there. If you keep in mind that the Europeans struggled to come up with 60,000 soldiers for a possible mission imposed for Ukraine under the coalition of the willing discussion, that gives Putin an idea that he could do a lot more damage with his forces as they are.
I just want to very briefly give Nick the last word. Is Ukraine optimistic that it can still achieve victory under these circumstances?
I think optimistic is maybe the wrong word, but people are certainly not willing to give in and to let Vladimir Putin have a kind of veto over this country's future. So I think they're going to carry on fighting whatever level of kind of supplies they get from Donald Trump and from the Europeans.
Thank you so much to Nick, to Wolfgang, Melinda, and Gustav for joining me. And to you from watching from home, thank you for watching To The Point. Let us know what you thought in the comments if you're on YouTube, and I'll see you next time.